in the 7th year of my marriage to Vernon. He became paralyzed while trying to save a drowning woman. I took care of him in bed, looked after his elderly parents, and raised our daughter for a full 20 years. On my deathbed, I saw the woman he had saved again. She was as beautiful and charming as she had been back then. However, the young man by her side bore a striking 9-point resemblance to Vernon. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself back in the year when Vernon became paralyzed. When I watched as Vernon pushed his wheelchair and left the courtyard alone. Today was my birthday. Ever since he became paralyzed, he would go out alone and stay away for a long time on this day every year. He said that on this day each year, he would repent for his impulsive decision to jump into the sea and save that poor woman, which had left him paralyzed and a burden to me. I was both sad and touched. And then I comforted him with tears in my eyes. You are the bravest man I've ever met. Don't forget, I'm the wife of a hero. That's how the media reported about me back then. Glorious, great, selfless, and unyielding. All of that belonged to my previous life. To the woman who had been imprisoned by life and worn down by it for a lifetime. I put down the potato in my hand and silently followed Vernon. He pushed his wheelchair with some difficulty along the gravel path, and then walked carefully along the very edge of the road. From time to time, kind-hearted people who recognized him would come up and ask if he needed help. He would smile and refuse their offer with pride and modesty. He didn't notice me following behind. He kept moving forward without stopping, showing some signs of anxiety. The wheelchair entered a park. I looked around and felt a sense of familiarity, but I couldn't remember when I had been here before. It wasn't until Vernon hid behind a thick pine tree and then cautiously poked his head out to look towards the crapple tree over there. I had loved crapple flowers the most before he had his accident. When we were dating, every year when the crapple flowers bloomed, we would go for a walk in the park. We were very poor at that time and could only borrow the public flowers to create a bit of romance. But at this moment, there was a strange pain in my heart. It wasn't until the woman in a white dress under the crapple tree stood up and I saw her face clearly. She was the woman Vernon had saved. The woman who had almost cost Vernon his life. She supported her bulging belly with one hand and walked forward weakly. As she walked, she suddenly turned around and looked in Vernon's direction. Their eyes met, and her tears instantly streamed down her face. She stumbled over and fell to her knees in front of Vernon, pressing her face against his palm. Vernon's tears also flowed down, and he reached out his hand to gently stroke her face. He called her softly, "Silly Claire. Why are you crying?" Her name was Claire. She had divorced last year, and her ex-husband was a gambler. I thought you wouldn't come to see me again. Just because of this sentence. Vernon's eyes became even redder, and he almost choked up. How could I bear not to see you? I'm just afraid of burdening you and our child. I felt as if my soul had been drained by these words. And I slumped down behind the flower bushes. Scenes from my previous life flashed through my mind like a movie. A woman was arguing with the vendor over a few dollars. A woman was pushing a bicycle in a shabby coat to pick up her daughter from school in the heavy snow. A woman in her 30s already had wrinkles all over her face as she pleaded with the government for more subsidies. Finally, having fulfilled my sigh, the image froze on the moment when she was on her deathbed, and a beautiful woman in a red dress walked up to Vernon. The young man beside her bore an 9-point resemblance to the young Vernon. The woman finally took her last breath and ended her life. I covered my mouth, afraid that my sobs would startle that infatuated couple. He said he was afraid of burdening Claire. But what about my whole life? He said he was afraid of burdening their child. But what about our daughter? I scrambled back home. There was a musty smell in the house. And our daughter Annie was sitting at the table, doing her homework seriously. When she saw me come in, she rushed to my side. She held a test paper with a full score in her hand. And then, with a look of guilt in her eyes, she took out another test paper with a score of 98 and apologized to me. I got white row or false question wrong. I'm sorry, Mom. I won't make the same mistake next time. The pain in my heart intensified. And I couldn't say a word. I just hugged her tightly in my arms. Mom, don't cry. I'll work hard. I'll get into a good university. Earn a lot of money to treat Dad's illness. And I won't let you suffer anymore. I remembered how strict I had been with her in my previous life. Knowing that I would be consumed by daily chores for the rest of my life, I pinned all my hopes on my only daughter. I hoped she would strive for success, be promising and wealthy in the future, and at least in terms of my child, I could experience the pride of a woman. At least, I could have one thing to be proud of. Later, Annie really got into the best university, but she developed severe depression before she was even 20. She tried to commit suicide several times and would have an emotional breakdown whenever she saw me. I didn't dare to see her for a full 10 years. Until the moment I took my last breath. I still hadn't been able to see Annie for the last time. I'm sorry. I should have said this to her in my previous life. Happy birthday, Mom. She reached out and stroked my hair to soothe me. When Vernon came back, it was already evening. When he saw me, he placed a bunch of crapple flowers in my hand and gently held my hand. I thought I could give you a better life. But I made you suffer so much. I lowered my head and looked into his eyes. The light in the room was dim, and I seemed to be back in that cold night. I was standing in the bone-chilling sea water. It was the 7th day after my parents passed away. I was only 16 years old. And in an instant, it felt like the whole world had been reduced to just me. I wanted to follow my parents and leave this world. Just as the water was about to submerge my head, a pair of strong hands grabbed my waist and dragged me up, desperately pulling me towards the shore. When I came to my senses, I only saw a familiar face. He looked at me furiously and scolded me for being a coward who didn't even have the courage to leave. He was Vernon, my classmate. Before that night, we were just classmates. And we had probably only said 1 or 2 words to each other. He had always been like that. Loyal and warm-hearted. I liked him for that. So, when he was lying in the hospital after saving Claire, although I was angry with him, it seemed that I had already expected something like this. He had always stood up for strangers, gotten into many fights, and suffered a lot of injuries. I loved his kind heart, Dennis. But I was also worried about him. The crapple flowers are really beautiful. I turned my eyes away. His eyes were no different from before. But now I felt disgusted when I looked at them. When did he start being with Claire? Was Claire's divorce related to him? Why were they both at the beach at the same time? When did he change? I didn't notice it at all. Before he came back, these questions had been swirling in my mind. Every time I thought about them, my heart ached. Vernon chuckled. Then I'll go and pick some more for you tomorrow. I nodded and smiled, okay. The next afternoon, he indeed pushed his wheelchair out again. I still followed him quietly. But this time, I took my phone with me. The two of them sat quietly under the crapple tree. If you ignored the wheelchair, they really made a good couple. I thought of my previous life again. Of Claire's red dress when I was on my deathbed. She was a year older than me, but she was so beautiful. As for me, since Vernon had his accident, I had never worn a dress or applied lipstick again. I had aged so quickly that I didn't even have time to choose a suitable dress. I dried my tears with the back of my hand and took a few photos with my phone. In the photos, the man gently tucked the stray hair beside his beloved woman's temple with a tender look in his eyes. On the way back, I took out the photos and looked at them from time to time. In fact, when Vernon and I were dating, we also took a lot of photos. He had looked at me with the same deep affection. I had never doubted his sincerity towards me in the past, but now, his feelings had changed. When we got back, Annie had just finished school, and I picked her up and we went home together. Is there anything you want to eat? Mom will buy it for you. She looked at the fried cakes beside her, swallowed, and shook her head. No. I want to eat the food you cook, Mom. My nose twitched with sadness. I walked over and bought the fried cakes and put them in her hand. If you want to eat anything in the future, just tell Mom, and I'll buy it for you. Annie stopped what she was doing and stared at me without moving. After a while, she immediately said as if making a vow, I will definitely get a full score next time. Mom, you have to believe me. My eyes were dry and painful. I stroked her hair. You don't have to get a full score. Mom just wants you to be happy and healthy. She blinked and then nodded doubtfully. On the way back, Annie suddenly asked me, "Is the money that uncle borrowed from our family never going to be paid back?" I stopped in my tracks. She was talking about the 100 yuan that Vernon had lent to a friend a year ago. Later, when he was lying in the hospital waiting for the money to save his life, I asked him to tell me who that friend was so that I could get the money back. But he said that the friend had already died, leaving behind only a disabled old mother. And he asked me not to disturb the old woman. Otherwise he would rather not receive treatment. A certain image flashed through my mind, and my heart suddenly started beating faster. When we got home, Vernon hadn't come back yet. I quickly rummaged through and found the newspaper that had reported on Vernon's heroic act of saving someone. There was an interview with Claire on the back of the newspaper. She said that she had divorced in February last year. February last year was exactly the month when Vernon lent out the money. Wasn't it? 3. Did Vernon give Claire 100 yuan? He would rather die than get the money back? And I, in order to pay for his surgery, had borrowed money from all my relatives on my mother's side. I had even been on the verge of kneeling down to the doctor, begging him to save Vernon. I bit the back of my hand. My teeth sank into my skin, and blood slowly seeped out. The pain in my heart eased a bit, and it also made me more clear-headed. I want a divorce. I want them to pay the price. Vernon had been immersed in sweet dates with Claire these past few days, with 2 women being loyal to him even though he was disabled. He must be feeling very proud, right? And I went to inquire about the reason for Claire's divorce. Her ex-husband was a gambler and a domestic abuser. Claire had filed for divorce several times, but the other party refused and even gave her a severe beating in return. So why did he agree to the divorce so readily this time? I went to the Maughorn parlor and found Claire's ex-husband, Jack. He had lost 800 yuan but didn't have the money to pay. So he was pinned to the ground and beaten. "I'll pay for him." Several men leered at me with lascivious eyes and snickered. "Not bad, Jack. You've hooked up with another one so soon? Was it this woman who gave you the 100 yuan back then?" Jack put down his hand that was covering his head and looked at me in confusion. I quickly paid the 800 yuan and grabbed Jack's hand, pulling him out. "I know you. You're the wife of the hero. What do you want from me? Didn't Vernon give you 100 yuan? He asked me to get the money back." He spat on the ground and said, "What did you say? Get the money back? Doesn't he want those photos anymore?" Sure enough, Jack must have something in his hands that made Vernon have to give him the money. "What photos?" He took out his phone and flipped through the pictures one by one for me to see. Vernon and Claire were lying naked in bed, hastily pulling the quilt over their bodies in fear, but their faces were clearly captured in the photos. "I'll buy this one." His hand stopped, and he frowned and glared at me. "Were you bluffing me just now?" "Fine. Is this the only one?" He rolled his eyes. "It's 10 yuan. 1 yuan. You son of a bitch." "Fine," let out a lull sigh. "If you don't want to sell it, that's okay." With that, I was about to leave. He quickly grabbed my hand and said, "Okay, 1,000 yuan it is." He sent the photo to me, and I gave him the money. I said, "Anyway, it's useless for you to keep it. If you were a journalist, you could make a fortune by exposing these photos." He checked the money transfer and furrowed his brows. His eyes rolled a few times, and he asked me in a low voice, "Would journalists really buy this kind of thing?" Before, there were journalists who came to my house to buy photos of Vernon being discharged from the hospital, and they offered a good price. Jack lowered his head, clenched his phone tightly, and before I could say anything else, he quickly ran out of the alley. I looked at his back. "Vernon, having fulfilled my ansai. When you were being praised highly while stepping on my flesh and blood, did you ever think that one day you would fall and be completely destroyed?" For I sent Annie to my best friend's house and then went home with the photo I had just obtained. As soon as I entered the door, I saw Vernon's mother, Ivy, was there. "Daphne is back?" She took out the steamed pork from her bag while smiling at me and waving. Vernon also smiled and said, "Mom cooked a lot of dishes that you and Annie like. None of them are for me." I looked at the dishes in her hand, walked over slowly, and asked softly, "Mom, having fulfilled my obsession, do you have any green plums?" Her hand froze in midair. But after a moment, she smiled kindly again. No. Do you want to eat green plums? I shook my head and didn't say anything. A few days ago, I saw a post on the WeChat Moments of a neighbor from my hometown. Ivy had bought more than 20 gin of green plums from her. Everyone in the family knew that I liked sour food. In previous years, whenever Ivy bought green plums, she would directly bring them to me. But this year she didn't. So who did she give the green plums to? The image of the woman in a white dress with a slightly bulging belly appeared in my mind. Ivy turned her head, glanced at my eyes, and immediately looked away. Her hands became flustered, and she quickly explained. I originally planned to bring them to you. But the green plums this time were not good. There were a lot of wormholes. I'll bring you some when I buy good ones. Vernon immediately came to smooth things over. We always put you first. People say that I don't look like Mom's son. But you are Mom's real daughter. Ivy laughed heartily. I've always treated Daphne as my own daughter. If you dare to bully her, I won't let you off the hook. What a rare and wonderful mother-in-law. I used to think so too. That's why, in addition to Vernon's high medical expenses over the years, I would also send money to my hometown every month. Ivy would always say no and then say that the money was saved for Annie. However, after Ivy passed away from illness, there was not a single penny left in her account. Where did all that money go? I had never been able to figure this out. But when I was on the verge of death and saw Claire and her son, I understood everything. Vernon was disabled and had no financial income. Since he had been living with me for years, it was inconvenient for him to support Claire and her son. So it had to be Ivy who did it. She was so eager to have a grandson. No wonder they were mother and son. They were both heartless and shameless. Ivy placed the dishes on the table one by one and then handed me the chopsticks herself. I didn't take them. Vernon nudged me with his elbow and motioned for me to take the chopsticks with his eyes. I still sat there without moving. Ivy looked embarrassed, looking as if she was about to cry. Vernon suddenly changed his expression. He took the chopsticks from Ivy's hand and stuffed them into mine, shouting angrily, Mom worked so hard to prepare these dishes for you. Don't be ungrateful. I turned my head and looked at him with a smile. Am I being ungrateful like this? Then what do you call it when you have a child with another woman behind my back, and your mom gives all the money I worked so hard to earn to the woman you're having an affair with? Is it ingratitude? Worse than animals? The two of them looked at each other and their faces changed simultaneously. Vernon blinked quickly and tried to cover it up. What are you talking nonsense about? Did someone tell you something? Don't listen to those people outside talking nonsense. I nodded. That's true. But what about this? How do you explain this? I turned on my phone, found the photo I bought from Jack, and showed it to Vernon and Ivy. What a heroic citizen who sacrifices himself for others. Who would have thought that the woman this hero saved from the sea was actually his mistress? Vernon's face turned livid, and his lips couldn't help but tremble. We've been together since we were teenagers. Have I ever done anything to let down you? He lowered his head and didn't dare to look at me. I sneered a few times and continued. You didn't want to burden Claire and your child. But did you ever think about me? Did you ever think about Annie? Why should my daughter and I spend our whole lives protecting the love of you two scoundrels? Who do you think you are? I picked up the steamed pork on the table and threw it hard in his face. Vernon didn't move at all. With oil all over his face, I think fulfilled my say. He didn't seem to feel the pain. He just looked at me quietly, his lips moving as he said, I'm sorry. Ivy let out a scream and immediately wiped her son's face with a loving and distressed expression. She turned around and glared at me. Why can't you talk things out properly? Why do you have to resort to violence? He's your husband. How can you treat him like this? I chuckled. He won't be my husband soon. Vernon quickly grabbed my hand. I'm sorry. It's my fault. Don't leave me. Please. His eyes were full of pleading. But in my mind, all I could think of was the sentence he said to Claire that day. I'm afraid of burdening you and the child. What was there left for me to be nostalgic about this man? I stood up, wiped the tears from my face, and looked down at him. I'll have the custody of Annie. There's still 30. Far you on in savings at home, which I earned. As for those debts, they were all borrowed in your name. And I don't think I have the obligation to pay them off. After my parents died, most of my relatives on my mother's side cut off relations with me. When Vernon suddenly had his accident, his relatives thought that as a woman, I couldn't handle things. No matter how much I begged, they refused to lend me money. In the end, Ivy borrowed the money in Vernon's name. In my previous life, I didn't pay off all the debts until I was 40 years old. And I also developed a lot of illnesses. I died before I was 50. I sacrificed my whole life for a despicable and ridiculous deception. This time, I'm going to live a good life with my daughter. Ivy was also taken aback when she heard about the divorce. But now that she was ready to break up with me, she didn't try to persuade me nicely. Instead, she threatened. Tong Xiao is a disabled person. The court won't agree to the divorce. I looked at his legs and nodded. That's true. But do you think the judge will still not agree if he knows why your precious son became disabled? Vernon finally showed a look of fear. He had a serious hero complex since he was a child and cared a lot about his reputation. Although he was now paralyzed, everyone said he was a hero. And he enjoyed the praise. However, once the fact that he committed adultery with the woman he saved during his marriage was exposed, his pride would be trampled underfoot by everyone in an instant. No. You can't. Vernon's Adam's apple rolled slightly. And he looked at me with a stiff expression. Daphne, we've been together for so many years. Even if I made a small mistake, don't you care about the affection we've had over the years? Are you going to completely ruin me? A small mistake? He actually said it was just a small mistake. I looked at his face. Yes. We had been together for more than 10 years. But now, looking at him, I felt so unfamiliar. If you still want to keep this false reputation, we'll go to the Civil Affairs Bureau to get a divorce tomorrow and then transfer the ownership of the house to her daughter. Tomorrow? Yes. Tomorrow. The nausea and anger in my heart erupted at this moment. I don't want to see you for even a second longer. Just looking at you makes me want to vomit. Vernon seemed to be struck by my words. Looking into my eyes, he said in a hoarse voice, "Okay." I took the documents, packed a few clothes simply, and without looking at them again, I ran out of the door. When I arrived at my best friend's house, she had already prepared the meal and was waiting. Annie seemed to sense something. She ran over and hugged my waist. Mom, don't abandon me. I'll be very obedient in the future. Don't leave me. Holding back the tears in my eyes, I squatted down, looked into my daughter's eyes, and answered seriously, Mom will never abandon you. I'm just leaving your dad. She was stunned for a moment. But, I continued, Mom will take Annie with me wherever I go. If you miss your dad in the future, you can go back and visit him. I won't ask her who she wants to stay with. No matter how she answers, the result will be the same. I must take my daughter away and will never let her live in that hellhole. The next second, a pair of small hands wiped the tears from the corners of my eyes. Mom, hadn't fulfilled my session. Annie will always be with you. 5 After coming out of the Civil Affairs Bureau, I looked at the divorce certificate in my hand and felt a little melancholy. After marrying him, I had never thought of getting a divorce. Before Annie was born, he was the only one in my life. All my plans for the rest of my life were closely related to him. I never expected that we would part ways in such a disgraceful way. Can I still see our daughter again? Vernon looked at me cautiously and asked in a low voice. I looked down at him and said, Aren't you going to have a child soon? Why do you still care about Annie? He lowered his head and didn't say anything more. Stop pretending to show fatherly love in front of me. When your family was scheming against our mother and daughter, why didn't you think that Annie is your daughter? Vernon clenched his hands and just whispered an apology. I didn't look at him anymore and turned around to walk to the street to hail a taxi. As I left, I saw Claire trotting up to Vernon. 6 After the divorce, I rented a house with my daughter, which was right next to her school. In fact, my salary wasn't low, and I could definitely give my daughter and me a better life. Annie was at the age of growing rapidly, and the clothes from last year were already too small for her. However, over the past year, I had been so busy running around for Vernon's medical expenses that I had neglected too many things. Mom, hadn't fulfilled my obsession. I wear my school uniform every day, so there's no need to buy new clothes. Annie looked at the price tag on the clothes with fear and shook her head repeatedly. No need to buy new ones. No need to buy new ones. I knew she liked little dresses. But in order not to put pressure on me, she wore her school uniform every day, so that I wouldn't notice the cuffs and hems that were too short for her. Wear the school uniform when you go to school, and in your free time, you can wear the clothes you like. Before, Annie's teacher said that she had a great talent for painting and hoped that I would consider signing her up for an interest class. I had already planned to sign her up for the class, and the child was very happy about it. But then Vernon had his accident, and the plan had to be put on hold. In the afternoon, I found the interest class recommended by the teacher and took Annie there. She held my hand tightly and asked, "Mom, what are we doing here?" I stroked her little head and said, "Don't you like painting very much? Mom has signed you up for a class. This way, you can make progress together with other children who like painting. And there will be professional teachers to teach you." "Really?" She was so happy that she almost jumped up. "Of course. You can come to class tomorrow." I seemed to haven't seen the smile on her face like this for a long time. But Mom, having fulfilled my obsession. She raised her smiling face and looked into my eyes. "I also hope you'll be happy. You know? You haven't smiled for a long time." My heart suddenly skipped a beat. I slowly raised the corners of my mouth, but found that my face was very stiff. I had been living for others for too long. When we were on our way back, my best friend Sally drove over. As expected, there were a lot of things in the trunk, including food, daily necessities, and even stationery for Annie. "I should have gone with you when you got divorced and given that scumbag a good beating." Sally took a bite of the skewer, took a sip of beer, and cursed angrily. I quickly glanced at Annie's room to make sure the door was closed. Sally was already a bit drunk. She slapped the table hard and said, "On the day you got divorced, he got a marriage certificate with that bitch Claire. Trash. Both of them are trash." I wasn't angry. Nor was I surprised. Vernon couldn't even get on the bed or go to the toilet by himself now. Even with his mother there. Didn't Ivy need to go out to work? They didn't have any savings. But they had a lot of debts. "Aren't you angry?" I shook my head and said, "Their lives will become more and more miserable, while my life is just beginning. Why should I be angry because of them?" These were my sincere words. It should be soon that the photos in Jack's phone would be made public. 7. The life of my daughter, and I was ordinary and comfortable. She became more and more lively and made a lot of new friends. Every day, she would chatter like a little talkative person and tell me the interesting things that happened at school. I could feel that because of my choice, she had changed a lot. Our lives were all moving in a direction that was completely opposite to that of our previous lives. And this was what I valued the most. 2 months later, the affair between Vernon and Claire was indeed exposed. Before this matter became a trending topic on the internet, Ivy was still playing the victim online, saying things like her daughter-in-law ran away because she disliked her son being disabled, and her granddaughter was now taught by her ex-daughter-in-law ought to recognize her own father. And she gained a lot of sympathy. Because of this wave of sympathy, Vernon received some financial support from some members of the public and the government. Just when they thought their life was going to get better, this scandal shattered their dreams like a bolt from the blue. After watching the exposed video, I realized that what Jack showed me that day wasn't all of it. There were even more vivid videos. In the video, Vernon and Claire were discussing where they would settle down after getting a divorce from me. Jack was also in this video, crying and complaining about how much damage Claire's infidelity had caused him. I had always been curious about why they fell into the water at the beach. Fortunately, the reporter asked Jack the question that I had in mind. Jack snorted and said, "Vernon was hesitant to get a divorce. And Claire was pregnant. So she threatened to commit suicide. So that was the reason." I looked at my phone and couldn't come back to my senses for a long time. Only at this moment did I confirm that the hero I liked when I was young was already dead. 8. Vernon was suddenly pushed to the center of public attention. And even Claire was exposed by netizens through digging up personal information online. Vernon had received a lot of help from the neighbors before. But now everyone was condemning him. There was no financial support for the family anymore. So Claire had to go out to work. She was already 7 months pregnant at this time and had to squeeze onto the bus every day with her big belly. Once we met on the street. And she was handing out flyers. She only had a junior high school education and had been a housewife for many years. Now, with her big belly, no one dared to sign a long-term contract with her. She also saw me and quickly lowered her head, but when she turned around, she bumped into a passerby and was splashed with hot coffee all over her body. The passerby didn't show any understanding just because she was a pregnant woman and immediately started cursing. Claire didn't dare to talk back and could only keep apologizing. I didn't feel sorry for her because in my previous life, it was me who lived such a life. And she and her son would take a part of my hard-earned money every month. When I got home, Annie was sitting downstairs. "Why are you sitting here? Didn't you bring your key when you went downstairs?" She shook her head and pointed upstairs with her little finger. "Dad is here." I wasn't surprised. Over the past 6 months, Annie had asked to go and see her father several times. However, Ivy had refused her every time. She almost commanded Annie in an authoritarian tone. "Don't go and disturb your father's new life." Vernon had never taken the initiative to call Annie either. "Let's go home. Mom will make your favorite braised prawns in oil for you today." The child's mood improved a bit. However, I didn't expect that Vernon would actually be sitting in my bedroom waiting for me. When I went in, his hand was still on my pillow. "What are you doing?" He was startled. And awkwardly withdrew his hand and explained. I thought this was our daughter's room. Does this look like a child's room?" My pajamas that I changed in the morning were still on the bed. It was too far-fetched to say that he mistook the room. Vernon looked up at me, his eyes slightly red, and said, "Do you hate me so much? I just miss you so much and want to be closer to you." He quickly pushed his wheelchair to my side and tried to hold my hand. But I dodged it. "Daphne, I know I was wrong. I really know I was wrong. I'm sorry." He cried and explained. "I was seduced by that bitch Claire. It's easy for a woman to chase a man. I didn't want to. But she had too many tricks." I looked at him, extremely disappointed. "I'd rather you say that you just changed your heart and fell in love with Claire. Maybe it's because she was beaten by her husband for years. Because she was pitiful. Or because she was beautiful. Whatever the reason, you just fell in love with her. At least, you have the courage to admit your mistake. At least it makes me feel that I didn't love the wrong person in the past. But now, you're pushing all the blame onto a pregnant woman. You really make me sick." Perhaps he didn't expect me to expose his hypocritical lies face to face. And his face turned red instantly. "No, I didn't say that to shirk my responsibility. I just want to tell you that I love you. The person I love has always been you." "Really? You? So what?" I interrupted him. "When did you realize that you've always loved me? Was it when Claire couldn't find a high-paying job to support you and your mother? Or was it when you were being condemned by everyone and she couldn't help you at all?" Vernon rolled his eyes, lowered his head, and when he looked up again, his face was covered with tears. "I just want our family to live like we used to. I know you hate me. But after all, I'm Annie's biological father. How can you bear to let the child grow up in a single-parent family? Even for the sake of the child. Won't you give me a chance?" Just as I was about to speak, the bedroom door was pushed open. And Annie walked in and stood beside me. She said to Vernon calmly, "Dad, if you loved me, you wouldn't have cheated. Wouldn't have a baby with another aunt. And wouldn't use me to threaten Mom." My heart was shocked. I tried my best to keep the child away from the adult matters. Just not wanting her to be involved in too much right and wrong. Unexpectedly, she actually knew everything. Annie raised her hand to wipe the tears on Vernon's face. And her tone was still calm. "Dad, although I live with Mom, she gives all her love to me. I've never been unhappy for a moment because of your lack of company." After saying that, she took my hand and gently scratched the palm of my hand with her little finger. "I hope you won't come to disturb Mom and me anymore. You've already caused Mom enough harm." Don't make me hate you. Okay? Vernon looked into Annie's eyes and didn't speak for a long time. I don't know how long it took before he sighed. I still don't know you and our daughter well enough. I thought. I interrupted him and sneered. You thought we were both so weak that we would just follow you home obediently with just a few words from you. Right? He shook his head. But I knew that's exactly what he thought in his heart. He sighed again, pushed his wheelchair and left. His back was lonely and desolate. Only then did I realize that he had lost a lot of weight. He was still wearing the trench coat I bought for him last year, looking like he was wearing an adult's clothes that didn't fit him. Annie and I stayed in the bedroom and didn't go out to see him off. You said you were going to find a job. But you actually came to see your ex-wife? A roar filled with grievance and anger rang out in the quiet corridor. Annie and I walked out and, as expected, saw Claire standing at the door, holding her belly. She was already 8 months pregnant, looking like a strange puppet. Her limbs were slender, making her belly look alarmingly large in contrast. Vernon glanced at Annie and then, with a cold face, scolded Claire. Don't make a scene here. Go home. Claire tried to rush in, but was blocked firmly by Vernon's wheelchair. You're protecting them? How did you promise me before? Vernon reached out and grabbed her wrist, trying to push her out, but Claire took the opportunity to try to squeeze in. In a hurry, Vernon actually knocked Claire down to the ground with his wheelchair. It hurt so much. My belly. I rushed forward. She was already pale-faced and sweating profusely from the pain. Vernon stared blankly at everything in front of him. Quick, what cat? Call 120. Hearing my shout, he then belatedly took out his phone and made the call. After both of them were taken away by the ambulance, Annie and I looked at each other and let out a sigh of relief. Mom, will that Auntie's baby be okay? At dinner, Annie asked. I shook my head. Mom doesn't know either. It should be okay. After all, medicine is so advanced nowadays. I didn't find out until a few days later that both Claire and her baby were safe. However, Claire had injured her body. Even though the baby was already 100 days old, her illness still hadn't recovered. Ivy finally shed her image as the kind and amiable mother-in-law and forced Claire, a sick person, to go out and find a job. But even though Claire worked as hard as she could, the money she earned was only enough to support herself and the child. Finally, Hetty fulfilled me one day, as if she had suddenly seen the light. She held the baby and wanted to divorce Vernon. Unfortunately, hadn't fulfilled, just as Ivy had said, given Vernon's situation, the court wouldn't easily grant the divorce. When I saw her again, she had been tortured beyond recognition by Vernon and his mother. She probably had no one else to talk to, so she held me and chattered on for a long time. Is it only you who's making money in Vernon's family now? She nodded. Then, whatever, sorry. Shouldn't you have the final say in Vernon's family? She stopped crying and stared at me blankly. I stood up and didn't look at her as I left. After Claire went home, she stopped giving Vernon any money for his treatment. So Ivy had to go back home and work hard in the fields to earn money for her son's medical expenses. But she was old, and soon she fell ill. Vernon was tortured by his illness and looked like a shadow of his former self. He pleaded with his wife to treat him. But by then, Claire had long since lost all affection for him and just wanted to live a good life with her son. A few years later, Vernon finally died of illness at home. Sally couldn't wait to see Vernon's pitiful state with her own eyes. She made inquiries everywhere and now described it vividly. I heard that his skin was all rotten, and there were signs of being beaten. Some people also said that in fact, he was starved to death. As for whether these were true or not, Vernon had already been cremated, and the truth could no longer be known. When Ivy heard the news, she couldn't catch her breath and died in the field. By the time she was discovered, her body had already started to stink. Claire got her freedom and left here with her son. Before leaving, she came to see me. You're still so beautiful, she said, looking at my face with a hint of envy. No, I should say you're even more beautiful than before. I'm sorry. As she spoke, she suddenly apologized. Then, let out a small sigh. Before I could say anything, she grabbed her son's hand and left. She was only 40 years old, but she was already hunched over and looked very old. I felt a bit sad. Looking at her. It was as if I was seeing myself in my previous life. Jack wanted to find Claire and actually came to me. Just by looking at the injuries on his face and his anxious expression, I knew he had lost another bet. Do you think I would know where she went? Even if I did know, why would I tell someone like him? He gave me a fierce glare and then ran away. A few days later, I'd heard that Jack had driven under the influence and his car had plunged into the sea. And he had drowned. Surprisingly, I actually felt relieved for Claire. Soon, let out a low sigh. Annie graduated from her senior year of high school. She chose the major she liked and went to the city she liked. As for me, I chat about gossip with Sally every day, go shopping, and occasionally go on trips. This time, both my daughter and I have become better and happier versions of ourselves. The end.